time for your News with Views alert. Are you ready? And now, Roger Fredenberg, your host. Here's today's alert. Tonight I want to focus on what I think is, at least my impression of what I see in the news, is that the precursors for World War III exist. I was reading Colonel Powell's book, or General Powell, Colin Powell's book. And he talks about, in the book, the orders that he got by Defense Secretary Dick Cheney. He got orders to draw up plans for using nuclear weapons against Iraq as they were leading up to the Persian Gulf War. And Powell, of course, said that he responded, "We're not going to let the genie loose." But Cheney said he was curious to know what would be required. So somewhere along the way, thinking about the war, the Desert Storm thing, they were talking about nuclear war. Now we have a lot of interesting things going on. Articles entitled U.S.-Russia Feel the Chill in the Air, West's Force in Bosnia Unraveling Relations, and of course some very strong statements being made by Boris Yeltsin. And then yesterday we had American balloonists shot out of the sky in Belarus. We had a grenade rocket launch through the walls of the embassy in Moscow. And things are not looking really, really bright out there, folks. And so I thought we'd invite Dr. John Coleman on this evening, and he could give us a little bit of history about Yugoslavia and these newly formed countries making up the former Yugoslavia, what the conditions are there, and where we're headed. John, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Roger. I'm glad to be back with you again tonight.
Yeah, it's been a while since we had you on the program, and we're glad to have you back. Can you help make some sense of what this whole thing's about? Well,
seemingly it's a real muddle, but actually when you get behind the scenes and look into it, it's very clear what's happening. We are in practically the same circle as we were in 1913, 1914, when the two Serbian assassins assassinated the Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo, which produced the First World War. And I would say that we are really, at this dramatic stage in the events, at that position. And I do believe that the shooting down of the balloonists is something akin to the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand. We are in a situation, of course, which has long been planned. This intrigue has been going on for centuries. And, you know, I study the history of what is Yugoslavia. It's actually an artificially created entity, an entity created by the British and the Americans. And really, there is no such country as Yugoslavia. But it was created after a great deal of strife and following the First and Second World Wars. And you have to contend with the factions that are there, and you must understand that Croatia, the nation of Croatia, is 10,000 years old. The Croatians are probably next to the Irish, the oldest people in Europe, the oldest nation in Europe. All of this stuff I dug out in the British Museum in London, and of course I also had access to the papers of Sir Fitzroy Maclean, who was the MI6 operative in charge of the whole Balkans operation, and how we intrigued with the United States to bring about these events that took place in the First and Second World War, and which has led up to the present precarious situation.
Well, let's see. We've got Serbia and Montenegro, Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia-Herzegovina. All this stuff going on, and then of course we have this Serbian faction inside what at least we call Bosnia. And I guess the history is dotted with all kinds of violent exchange.
Violent exchange is the word. And, you know, one of the things that struck me recently, we had the Serbian commanding general there, and he was saying that he can't move the guns, the 155 millimeter guns and the howitzers that are around Sarajevo, because he said he needs them to protect the Serbians down there. But when this thing started, the GCHQ, that's the British listening post on Cyprus, they actually picked up a transmission between Nadic and his commander in the field, and Nadic was saying that they must use the 155s on downtown Sarajevo, and his commander on the field was saying, but General, there are lots of Serbians down there, and he said, burn them all with the 155s. So much for his story that the guns are there to protect the Serbians in the area.
So where do you, of course, today peace broke out everywhere, you know. The big peace agreement began, the ceasefire is on, and the Serbs now say that they are going to move their big guns out. Does that
Well, that remains to be seen. We've heard the story literally, I would say at least 20 times in the past 2 years. And, you know, the whole thing has been largely a deception worked out by the British. We had the United Nations commander, Lord Rose, I think his name was, or Sir, whatever his name was. He was hand in glove with the Serbians. And we were actually, through the United Nations, feeding the Serb convoys, allowing them to take so much off as tribute without any pretensions or cover-ups. And we were, every time they said, well, we allow you to use the Sarajevo airport, they exacted tribute from the United Nations. And Rose, the commander, UN commander, went right along with this.
Is there a right and wrong in this whole fiasco, or are both sides wrong?
No, there's a right in it. You must understand that on March the 20th, it goes back, you know, it would take me at least, I would imagine, 3 or 4 broadcasts to even scratch the surface historically of this thing. But you have to go back to the beginning of the time when, I think it was in 1929, after the First World War, King Alexander, formerly the Prince Alexander, was a puppet for Britain. He dissolved all parties and declared Yugoslavia a dictatorship. And then on November the 9th, I think it was 1931, the King Alexander allowed farcical elections, and he named most of the candidates himself. And then on November the 14th, 1932, I think my dates are correct, I'm quoting from the top of my head now, the Croat Peasant Party denounced the new government, which they called a regime, which was packed with Serbians, and they demanded autonomy following the imprisonment of their leader. I think his name was Maček, M-A-C-H-E-C-K, if I'm not mistaken,
yes,
which had occurred about a month earlier. And then, you know, there was a 7-year struggle. And finally, I think it was in August of 1939, the Croatians got at least a promise of impartial elections. But on May the 27th, 1941, I believe it was, Yugoslavia was invaded by Germany, which was done ostensibly to protect its Balkans flank. And the Serbians, who hated Germany, united behind the communists under Joseph Broz Tito. Then, as we know, launched a guerrilla campaign against the German army, which was in defiance of the Geneva Conventions, which forbids civilian attacks on military forces. Anyway, the sad story is that Tito and his partisans were run, as I mentioned earlier, by Sir Fitzroy MacLean, who was SIS chief of the Balkans operations and a great confidant of Winston Churchill's. And Tito's so-called Chetniks, they received their arms and shipments and considerable help from the British. And, of course, their deeds were wildly exaggerated. And they were lauded all over Western newspapers as the great heroes of the Balkans. But then in, I think it was sometime, when was that now? Anyway, soon after the Germans invaded Yugoslavia, King Peter fled to London. Of course, he was intimately connected with the British black nobility led by Queen Victoria, the Venetian oligarchists who really took up the throne of England, and of course today are still behind all the events that are happening in that area of the world. And you know, the Crown Prince Peter, he was a cousin of Prince Philip, the husband of Queen Elizabeth II. In fact, his Crown Prince Alexander is the Queen's godson, as far as I know.
Do you think that the relationship between the Serbs, even the Bosnian Serbs, is linked strongly enough to Moscow that we could actually end up back in the Cold War?
It's very possible. The Russian nationalists, I've been reporting on the Russian nationalist movement since 1969, I think I was probably one of the earliest writers in America to bring the attention of the United States people to Pamyat, which is a Russian nationalist organization made up of Russian officers and the Historical Monuments Commission. And at that time, of course, they were led by Colonel Victor Oxnes, and they're pretty strong and powerful. And I think Yeltsin's days are absolutely numbered. I don't think he's going to last beyond December. General Lebed is very popular there. He's a young general who's resigned rather than take orders from Yeltsin. And I think he spells big trouble for Yeltsin and for the United States of America also, because these army officers, led first by Colonel Victor Oxnes, they were the ones who gave James Baker III such a rough time during the Persian Gulf War. When he came to Moscow, they got his car stranded in the middle of the winter snow, and nobody would go and help him. And we had the ignominious sight of our Secretary of State standing there in the snows of Moscow and his car not able to move, and that kind of thing. And then, when he came after the big attacks on the Iraqis, when he came back to Moscow 3 months later thinking it was all over, he was met for the first time by a delegation of these Russian officers and not by the Russian State Department officials. So there's been a long-standing animosity between the Russian nationalist patriotic forces and the government of the United States of America in Washington, even during the days of Stalin, of course.
So then, yesterday we have this rocket launched into our embassy, and of course then the government there says it's the act of a lone maniac. But about the same time that's happening, we have two American balloonists, entering into an international race, shot out of the sky over Belarus.
Well, as I told you...
Is there a connection?
I believe that to be the case, certainly. We have to look back at history, and we have to see that the First World War was started by two lone madmen, two anarchists out of Serbia, who came forward and shot the Archduke Ferdinand. He's riding in the carriage, and of course, that was known to all of the so-called allies long before it happened. And I do believe all of these incidents are created. Because what we have in the world today, and we have it particularly in the United States, is we create a crisis and then we step forward and manage it. And it's easy to do because the crisis the crisis is managed by the very people who created it in the first place. And I see a very strong link between what is happening now in Belarus and Moscow and events in Serbia. It could be the trigger that is required to bring United States forces into play in that area. Of course, that would be a disaster for the United States. We must absolutely stand pat and stand absolutely fast and not allow that to happen. In the June issue of my World in Review magazine, I gave all of the steps that need to be taken to stop the war in the Balkans without putting any United States troops in there at all. And I think it's a very feasible plan. I've talked to a lot of people, my peers around the world, about this, and they all tell me this is an excellent plan that I came up with. It's not a new plan. We did it with Saddam Hussein during the Gulf War. We did it with Pablo Reza, the Shah of Iran, as well. And it's really an economic solution. And as you well know, Roger, all wars are economic in origin. So we can stop this Balkans thing if we adopt economic measures. We know all where the banks are that are being used by the villain in this piece is Slobodan Milosevic. This is the villain. This is the man who started the whole thing. And we must not forget that he was a staunch leading communist under Tito. And he's still a communist as far as I'm concerned. Oh, he carries with him the trappings of so-called democracy, but this man at heart is definitely a communist. And of course, if he can be used as a puppet, as a tool of the Western powers to really get the thing going, don't forget the international bankers love wars. They need them every 25 years or so to keep their coffers filled. And we're just about in that cycle now where another war is very necessary for the international bankers.
What do they benefit from a war? How can a war possibly create wealth for banks?
Well, to start with, all sides in the conflagration are supplied by the bankers. We saw that since the beginning of I would say, the last 200 years. You can certainly count on the fact that every revolution, every war at its origins, economic causes, and of course the bankers have financed all sides to the wars, and they've come up trumps with all the money. And of course we know that in the scheme of things of the New World Order, of which the strongest disciple in the world today is the former President of the United States, George Bush. Well, he greatly favored the stratagem of using the international banks to finance both sides of the war. We had it in the Civil War in the United States of America as well. And of course, in the Second World War, the Bolshevik Revolution was financed by both sides. And it was, of course, caused by the Rothschilds jerking the rugs out from the Tsar of Russia. And so on and so forth. It goes on and on and on throughout recorded history.
All right, Dr. Coleman, I've got to do some commercials. And then I'm going to open the phone lines up so that the audience can call in and ask questions of you on this, I think, very delicate and dangerous subject. And before I do that, are we headed to World War III?
I believe so. I think in 1992 I warned that a major war. And these issues are all available. Everything I'm telling you tonight are available in the 10 issues that I began writing in 1991. And the first major work I did was called Why Yugoslavia? It was called A Critical Analysis, in which I go through the entire history of the region. Then the second one was another major work in which I spell out exactly what it's all about, and I call that Yugoslavia in Focus. Then I've done 10 articles in World in Review from 1992 right up to the present day, and I'm going to offer these later to your listening audience if they are interested in getting them.
Okay. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to go ahead and open the phone lines, and you can get lined up to talk to Dr. Coleman. If you're in the local audience, you'll need to use the priority line this evening. All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I am Roger Fredenberg, radio's regular guy. Our guest this evening, Dr. John Coleman. Dr. Coleman, of course, the author of the Committee of 300 and other books of great interest, and he can tell you about them. You may want to order them. But he also puts out World in Review. If you're not reading World in Review, then you're missing a lot of very important information that would really keep you up to date on what's happening on the international front as well as local or national here in America. Great newsletter. And we're back with Dr. Coleman. And Dr. Coleman, I think we're going to go right to the phones.
Okay.
All right, we'll start with Gene in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, WGNS Country. Hello, Gene.
Hello, Roger. You have a terrific guest there and a great program.
Thank you.
Dr. Coleman, is it?
Yes, sir.
First, I'd like to make a comment about why the wars, why they would want a war. Central bankers in Greenspan, their whole waking moment is spent to figure out ways to put us in debt. I mean, they have to create debt. That's the way they survive and prosper. And so the reason for wars is they get everybody in debt, and you wouldn't have our Congress trying to balance our budget. They would take the pressure off of Congress if they get us in such debt. I'd like to ask Dr. Coleman, how would your peace plan satisfy this need of the central bankers to create world debt?
Oh, it wouldn't satisfy them at all. In fact,
and it wouldn't work. They wouldn't let it
jerk
work.
The rug out from underneath their feet. We don't want to get our sons and daughters in another foreign war where they are going to lie in foreign fields, and then we come back here and wave the flag and say they died for the country.
That's right.
If they get into this mess there, they're not going to be dying for the country. They'll be dying for the international bankers, as they've done with every war.
That's right.
That's ever been fought this century.
So these bankers aren't going to, how are they going to let your peace plan work?
They're not, but I have a plan nevertheless, and I've been told by others that it's a workable and a very good plan.
I'd sure like to hear. Of course, it's been probably detailed, but I wonder if you could give a synopsis or something of it.
Well, I can't do that over the air, but I am going to offer it if Roger will allow me. I'm going to tell you how you can get this from us later in the program.
Why don't
yes,
you...
I'm really interested in that.
All right, thank you, Gene. Why don't you now tell them, and then later we'll try to do it again as well.
All right. I feel that if you really want to understand this, you must know the historical background. You must know how the American-British war machine has inveigled the situation, which began on February the 22nd, 1916, when the European forces wanted to drag America into the war to pull their chestnuts out of the fire, and they had House, who was the controller at that time of Woodrow Wilson, and Sir Edwin Grey get together, and they said to the Serbs, look, if you come in and fight us, help us by fighting against the Germans, we will make sure that you get the entire coastline along the Adriatic, and that's what the Serbians are actually holding them to today. I mean, it is so crazy that... But all of this is detailed in my work, Why Yugoslavia? A Critical Analysis, Yugoslavia in Focus, which brings it right up to date, and then 10 articles in my World in Review magazine from January 1992 up to this time. You can purchase this for a very nominal sum. And I think, in all modesty, I can say that from the letters I've been getting from people who've had this, they've said that it's really shone the searchlight on the area and made them understand what's happening. And you can do this by calling, and those of you who order will receive a complimentary copy of my World in Review magazine for August, and a catalog which will show some of the over 400 works I've written.
All right, well, let's go to Ruth in Grants Pass. Hello, Ruth.
Well, since we surely can't have this dollar sign business going, perpetuating forever, over and over again, I wonder if you know whether or not there's any way that all these people running the fiascos could be made to realize that when we pass on from this life, this world, that in the next world we will receive crowns according to what we did in this world. And so there would have to be some kind of a motivation like that to end this dollar sign business that's perpetuating.
Well, I don't know if you've made a statement or if you're asking me a question, but if it's a question, I would say yes, they certainly know about that, but they march to a different drummer. Their God is not the one that we, by and large, would say is the God of this universe, and they march to an entirely different drummer, but that's another aspect, a very deep aspect, which I couldn't possibly get into tonight. I have written a lot of works about it, though.
Yes. Let's go to Tommy in Grants Pass, a new caller. Hello, Tommy.
Yeah, Roger, I'd like to ask you and your guest about a constitutional thing that hasn't been implemented since I can remember, and here I am in my 70s, and that is why the United States sends troops, money, and war implements to other countries when it's against the Constitution.
Oh, it is absolutely in violation of the Constitution. And I've said for years that we ought to hold our so-called representatives in Washington, we ought to hold their feet to the fire and make them obey the Constitution and tell them in no uncertain manner that to violate their oath of office is treason. That's the plain and simple bottom line of it all. And they need to obey the Constitution. The President has no war powers at all. He cannot send troops out of the country except for a limited period. I think it is 45 or maybe 60 days, and then he can only use one branch of the services. And he has never got a declaration of war. Bush never got one in the Gulf. And, of course, as far as I'm concerned, all of those who obeyed the orders of Bush, including the general that you quoted earlier, did not uphold their oath of office to uphold the Constitution of the United States of America. We have no business sending foreign American troops to foreign lands, and we have no business doing it so under the Constitution. We can only do it under a declaration of war, which is a 5-step complicated process.
Yeah, and here's another thing, too, is the implements of war. It is against the Constitution to even sell armament to other countries.
100%
now,
so.
Here is where the bankers come in that you spoke about.
That's right.
They want to get the big bucks. And where can they get it? Through armament.
Well, that's what's happening. Yugoslavia has got one of the biggest armament factories in Europe, and they were aided in this by Lawrence Eagleberger, who was a former Secretary of State under Kissinger. He even opened up a branch bank for them in New York, which was a wondrous achievement. And their armaments industry is what's keeping their offensive going against the Bosnians and the Croatians.
And I have been trying to get people worked up about this constitutional thing and against Congress, like you were saying, hold their feet to the fire. But I'm getting nowhere. Maybe if we can get it out over the air, we'll get enough people stirred up, we can do something about it.
Well, that's the only
All right,
hope
Tommy,
we've got.
And thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night, sir.
Yeah, I think that Tommy hits on a key point here. The Constitution, what Congress leans on is the War Powers Act, which in itself is unconstitutional.
The War Powers Act is ultra-virus and of no force in effect, therefore an obligation upon no one.
All right, 1-800-449-8255. The number here is 800-449-8255. We also have a priority line available at 503-664-8255. Let's go to John in Washington, D.C. John, you're on the radio.
How do you do?
Good.
I just wanted to ask your guest how he feels this flight of these two balloons and then over Poland that were shot down, how this relates to the Yugoslavian situation in a way that can be understood. I mean, I know how I feel it relates, but how do you feel that it relates?
Well, how would the firing of a grenade into the American embassy relate to the situation? These are supposedly people. Supposedly the Russian nationalist movement, which I don't believe for 1 minute is involved, in order to get stirred up hatred of the American people so that they can have a provocation for going into the situation. Don't forget the Serbs have been traditional allies of the Russians for centuries.
Well, it's more than traditional allies. The Russians are Serbians who moved north during the time of the expansion of the Macedonian and Roman empires. But the point is that if you can imagine how the average American would feel if at this time, today, right now, the Japanese were bombing somebody in the Philippines or in Indonesia, and they had a large army somewhere, and they had a fleet, and they were involved in strife between Muslims and Christians in Indonesia and the Philippines, and then all of a sudden some balloons appeared over Hawaii that were Japanese. I think the average American would want to shoot down those balloons. And the average East European knows that, this is exactly how World War I and World War II began. First, there was fighting in Yugoslavia, in the Balkans, and then the West or the Germans or whoever attacked into Poland. And that's exactly the same way that they feel about it right now.
Well, exactly. The whole thing is layered as part of a strategy, and we've also always intervened in the affairs of other countries, again in violation of the Constitution of the United States of America.
All right, gentlemen, I have to go to break, so just hold on there. Folks, please remember to contact MagSoft. We really did get MagSoft's no-salt magnetic water conditioner and put it at my dad's house. My dad did install it himself, and it really does work. He had a terrible hard water problem, one of the worst I've ever seen, and it's been resolved. It's been resolved because we had the courage to try. Have the courage to try. Call MagSoft. You get a 90-day money-back guarantee. If you've got hard water, and you'll have a ring in your toilet, that crusty buildup in your shower head, spots in your car when you wash it, your clothes will start looking dingy when you wash them. Call MagSoft. I'm telling you. Plus, if you've got chlorine, you live in the city, got that nasty chlorine, well, guess what? Gets rid of that too, huh? How can you beat the deal? Call MagSoft. Try the product. No risk. 90-day money-back guarantee. 1-800-929 7638. That's 800-929-7638. 800-929-SOFT, S-O-F-T. And then, of course, remember to order your OPC grapeseed extract.
Say, is this where you have that high-tech brushless wash?
All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Our guest is Dr. John Coleman. Dr. Coleman has over 400 written works, all of them worth reading. And he would share them with you. He'd give you a complimentary copy. That's right, no charge. A complimentary copy of his World in Review magazine. I keep calling it a newsletter, John, only because that's what you get caught up in this trade. And of course, yours really is quite different than the average newsletter, and we appreciate it.
32 pages. That's the difference.
Yeah, and it's just absolutely filled with viable information that I think people really need to have. And I appreciate you giving a complimentary copy to people in the audience that call. And, of course, I would encourage them to look at other works that you've done because they're incredible. I'm going to give your number one more time before we go to the phones. You can contact Dr. Coleman. I suppose business hours generally are better, huh?
That's right. From tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., that's Pacific time. We're in Nevada, but we have the Pacific time.
All right. His number, 1-800-942-0821. That's 800-942-0821. Let's go to Jack in North Bend. Hello, Jack.
Good evening, Roger, and the good Dr. Coleman. Yeah, I have. What I've observed, I've been looking at history for about 45 years, and what I get out of this is basically we have what I call a warring planet, and yeah, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Now that's true. That's the munitions that you've been talking about. But my question is this to you, since you've studied history as well as you have, is as I feel that Russia, the USSR, as it was, is basically was a paranoid state or a paranoid country. Do you agree with that or not?
Well, are you talking about the former Soviet Union?
Yeah, right, the former Soviet Union.
Yes, they were always a paranoid nation because they were a thorn in the side of the one world government, the New World Order. The one country that the Committee of 300, which I wrote in my book, could not bring to heel and could not bring into the fold to complete the circle, which would allow them to start the New World Order, was the USSR. And, of course, Stalin said he wouldn't come into this because he didn't trust the people in Washington at any time.
Really?
And so they were never able to get Russia quite into their fold, the USSR. Now that Stalin is gone, the military are even more paranoid.
Oh, so
they don't trust the United States 1 inch.
So what you're telling me that the Russia, the USSR, was against the one world order?
Yes.
Really?
They refused to be subjugated by it.
Well, how about that? Maybe I better
The
read
Korean
more.
War was fought to teach Stalin a lesson, to contain him and to show him that he couldn't go his own way, and that cost us 59,000 lives in Korea.
Is that a fact? Well, I guess you just told me something I didn't know.
All right, Jack, thank you very much.
You.
Tricia in Grants Pass, Oregon, how are you?
Hi, Dr. Coleman. I would like to ask you if we get Pat Buchanan elected president and Charles Collins for vice president, is that going to straighten anything out, or are we still going to have to get the right congressmen and the right senators in there? Otherwise, they won't get much done.
No,
and
they
another
won't.
thing I was wondering about is what about this monetary system? Can we say we hereby rescind these debts, instead of passing them on to our children for generations, they always forgive them for their debts, those foreign countries, so why can't the American taxpayer be forgiven?
Well, the American taxpayer could be forgiven overnight. Congress has the power to rescind the Federal Reserve Board's charter tonight if they so chose, and of course they could do the same. They could wipe the slate clean of the so-called debt owing by the American people.
John, is there anyone in the candidacies for president that you have seen yet that really would give real hope?
No, absolutely not.
So what do you think of guys like Buchanan, who seem to be on the right track against GATT, against NAFTA, a little more nationalistic?
Well, let me say that Buchanan, is, in my opinion, is the best of a bad bunch. I think Buchanan by himself is okay, but I don't know what influences he may be subjected to. Of course, the others are all members of the secret orders and members of the Council on Foreign Relations. They're all controlled out of the Royal Institute for International Affairs, as has been since 1912.
How do they control them?
Well, they deliver their orders through the Royal Institute for International Affairs, and don't forget, they select the candidates. We do not select the candidates ourselves. These candidates are elected for us, and through the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations, which is the greatest brainwashing, I use the term so that everybody can understand it, institution in the world, they are able to, what they will call, their term is conduct long-range penetration warfare against the American people. They did this against the Germans in the Second World War, and in 1946, when Germany was no longer the enemy, they turned their attention to the people of the United States of America, and they have been conducting long-range penetration and inner conditioning. That's there from their manual I happen to have.
Well, you bring that up, and before we get to the end of the program, I wanted to say something. In 1950, if 2 American balloons would have been shot down over Belarus, there'd have been a scream for war.
Well, look what happened.
The people in this country would have been jumping up and down screaming for war.
What happened when the Barbary pirates attacked our ships? You know what happened? We immediately enfiladed them and shot them right out of the waters. But we don't, I think what is going on today with these 2 balloonists, this is a layered transaction, for want of a better description, which they hope will get us into this Third World War. And usually is always an appeal
Okay,
to
but
patriotism and to nationalism.
When you talk about this internal conditioning, and the reason that interested me was because, okay, we had KAL-007 aircraft shot down by the Russians. Congressman Larry McDonald was on that airplane, one of the most recognized conservative advocates in this country.
I knew MacDonald because I addressed a conference that he attended in Costa Rica, I think, in a very early part of his career, and I knew him from that encounter. So, yes, it was shot down, and of course we did nothing about it.
And of course, to make my point, it seems as though the American people have gotten to be so complacent that they just really don't care.
Well, they're not complacent. The thing is, they've been conditioned.
Yeah, well, and of course that's an interesting concept, and I see certain types of conditioning all the time in the media, so I guess I agree with you.